Welcome to today's episode of Journeys of Survival, Untold Stories of Human Migration. You're about to witness one of history's most remarkable stories of resilience, adaptation, and survival against impossible odds. Picture this. It's July 31st, 1492. The same year, Christopher Columbus sets sail for the New World. An entire civilization is being torn from its roots. On the cobblestone streets of Seville, families clutch whatever possessions they can carry. Children cry, not understanding why they must leave the only home they've ever known. Elderly grandparents take one last look at synagogues where their ancestors prayed for over 1,000 years. In a single day, 200,000 people, an entire community that had thrived in Spain for 15 centuries, are forced to choose between their faith and their homeland. But this isn't where the story begins, nor is it where it ends. What you're about to discover is how one people, scattered across continents and centuries, managed not just to survive, but to transform every corner of the world they touched. From the golden age of medieval Spain to the bustling streets of New York's Lower East, aside from the ancient walls of Jerusalem to the modern state of Israel, this is the extraordinary tale of the Jewish diaspora, a 2,000-year journey that would reshape civilization itself. Why did millions of people willingly abandon everything they knew, walking thousands of miles into uncertainty? What force was so powerful it could scatter a nation across every continent on Earth? And how did this dispersion, born from persecution and pain, become one of history's greatest stories of human triumph? Today, we all uncover the hidden forces that drove the largest and longest migration in human history, a movement that began with ancient empires and continues to this day, touching every corner of our modern world. Chapter 1. The First Exile. The year is 586 BCE. Jerusalem burns. Smoke rises from the Temple of Solomon as Babylonian soldiers systematically destroy what had been the beating heart of the Jewish people for 4 centuries. King Nebuchadnezzar's forces don't just conquer, they obliterate. The walls of Jerusalem crumble under the weight of battering rams. The sacred vessels of gold and silver are carted away as spoils of war. And in chains, thousands upon thousands of Jews begin a forced march toward Babylon, 900 miles away across the desert. Picture the scene. Families torn from homes they've known for generations, carrying whatever they can salvage from the ruins. Children cry for toys left behind in the rubble. Elderly grandparents struggle to keep pace with the relentless march eastward. Priests clutch fragments of sacred scrolls, all that remains of centuries of accumulated wisdom. This isn't just military defeat, it's the systematic dismantling of an entire civilization. The journey itself becomes a test of survival. The Babylonian army pushes its captives across hundreds of miles of harsh terrain. Water is scarce. Food is rationed. The weak fall by the wayside. Those who survive the march arrive in Babylon fundamentally changed, no longer the proud inhabitants of an independent kingdom, but refugees dependent on their conqueror's mercy. When Nebuchadnezzar deported the Judeans in 597 and 586 BC, he allowed them to remain in a unified community in Babylon. But this wasn't merely conquest, it was the shattering of a world. For the first time in their history, the Jewish people faced an impossible question. How do you maintain your identity when your homeland, your temple, your entire way of life has been destroyed? The psychological trauma ran deeper than physical displacement. The temple wasn't just a building. It was the cosmic center of Jewish existence, the place where heaven and earth intersected, where God's presence literally dwelled among the people. Without it, fundamental questions arose. Where is God now? How can we worship without sacrifices? What does it mean to be God's chosen people when we've been defeated by pagans? The Babylonians had perfected the art of conquest through displacement. They understood that scattered people lose their power to rebel. Move them from their ancestral lands, separate them from their holy places, and they become manageable subjects rather than dangerous enemies. It was a strategy that had worked countless times before against the Assyrians, the Elamites, and dozens of other conquered peoples who had simply vanished into history. But something unexpected happened by the rivers of Babylon. In the settlements along the Euphrates River, where Nebuchadnezzar had relocated the Jewish exiles, a remarkable transformation began. Instead of assimilating into Babylonian culture or disappearing entirely, the Jewish exiles began to adapt in ways that preserved their identity while enabling survival in a foreign land. The first innovation was institutional. Without a temple, they created synagogues, gathering places that could exist anywhere, requiring no special priesthood or elaborate rituals. These weren't just religious buildings, but community centers where people could maintain connections, share news from other settlements, and preserve their cultural memory through storytelling and communal meals. The second innovation was textual. Scribes and scholars began collecting, organizing, and writing down the oral traditions that had previously been transmitted informally from generation to generation. Laws were codified, histories were recorded, prophecies were preserved. The very text that would become the Hebrew Bible took shape during this period of exile, carrying within them both the memory of what had been lost and the hope of what might be restored. The third innovation was theological. Jewish thinkers began to reconceptualize their relationship with God in ways that didn't depend on geography. If God was truly universal, then divine presence wasn't limited to Jerusalem or the temple. God could be worshipped anywhere through prayer, study, and ethical behavior. This insight would prove revolutionary, creating the foundation for a portable religion that could survive and thrive regardless of political circumstances. Meanwhile, another group of Judeans fled to Egypt, where they settled in the Nile Delta, particularly in the area that would later become Alexandria. These refugees took a different path, gradually adopting Egyptian customs and eventually Greek language and culture when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. From 597 onwards, there were three distinct groups of Hebrews, a group in Babylon and other parts of the Middle East, a group in Judea, and another group in Egypt. Each community developed differently. The Babylonian Jews became scholars and merchants, eventually producing the Babylonian Talmud, one of the most important works of Jewish law and commentary. The Egyptian Jews became more Hellenized, translating Hebrew scriptures into Greek and creating the Septuagint, the version of the Bible that would influence early Christianity. The Jews who remained in Judea struggled under foreign rule while maintaining temple worship until its final destruction in 70 CE. The economic adaptation was as crucial as the religious and cultural changes. Exiled from their agricultural homeland, Jews in Babylon were forced to develop new economic strategies. They became traders, artisans, and middlemen, skills that would serve Jewish communities throughout the diaspora for centuries to come. They learned to assess markets, navigate foreign legal systems, and build trust across cultural boundaries. The social structure also evolved. Traditional tribal and territorial divisions became less important than religious learning and commercial success. A new class of religious scholars emerged, distinct from the hereditary priesthood, whose authority came from knowledge rather than birth. These scholars would eventually become the rabbis who would lead Jewish communities throughout the diaspora. The psychological impact of exile created both trauma and opportunity. The trauma manifested in texts like Psalm 137, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept when we remembered Zion." The pain of displacement, the longing for home, and the humiliation of defeat became permanent elements of Jewish consciousness that would echo through the centuries. But exile also created opportunity. Freed from the constraints of a traditional agricultural society, Jews in Babylon could experiment with new forms of religious expression, new economic activities, and new ways of organizing community life. They developed what we might call the first virtual homeland, a sense of shared identity and common purpose that transcended geography. When Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in 538 BCE and issued his famous decree allowing exiled peoples to return to their homelands, the Jewish response was complex and revealing. While some Jews enthusiastically embraced the opportunity to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, many others chose to remain in Babylon. They had built new lives, established businesses, created communities. The idea of return was appealing in theory, but the reality of Babylon had become home. This choice to remain in the diaspora, even when return became possible, established a pattern that would repeat throughout Jewish history. It created the fundamental dynamic of Jewish life, the tension between the pull of the homeland and the reality of life in the wider world. It established Jews as a people equally at home everywhere and nowhere, carrying their true homeland not in geography, but in law, custom, and collective memory. Those who did return to Jerusalem found a devastated land that bore little resemblance to the glorious kingdom their grandparents had described. The rebuilt temple was smaller and less magnificent than Solomon's. The returned exiles often clashed with the people of the land who had never left. Political independence remained elusive as the province of Yehud remained under Persian control. Yet the return migration was crucial for Jewish survival. It re-established Jerusalem as a physical center of Jewish life and proved that the connection between the Jewish people and their ancestral homeland could survive even centuries of exile. The rebuilding of the temple provided a focal point for Jewish identity and a destination for pilgrimage that would remain important until the Roman destruction in 70 CE. The Babylonian exile thus created the template for Jewish survival that would persist for over 2 millennia. It established Jews as a people who could maintain their identity across vast distances and long periods of time. It proved that Jewish civilization could adapt to changing circumstances without losing its essential character. It created the institutions, practices, and mindset that would enable Jewish communities to survive and thrive throughout the diaspora. Most importantly, it demonstrated that catastrophe could become opportunity. The destruction that was meant to end Jewish civilization instead transformed it, making it more resilient, more adaptable, and ultimately more influential than it had been when confined to a small kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean. The exile that began in chains ended with the creation of the first truly global culture in human history. The first exile had ended, but the age of diaspora had begun. What started as forced displacement had become a chosen way of life, setting the stage for a pattern of migration and adaptation that would span 2 millennia and transform both the Jewish people and the world they helped to shape. Instead of disappearing into history like so many conquered peoples, the Jewish exiles did something revolutionary. They adapted while refusing to assimilate. They created synagogues, places of gathering and prayer that could exist anywhere, independent of geography. They developed new ways to study their laws and maintain their traditions without a temple. They built communities within communities, preserving their distinct identity while learning to thrive in foreign lands. Another group of Judeans fled to Egypt, where they settled in the Nile Delta. So from 597 onwards, there were 3 distinct groups of Hebrews: a group in Babylon and other parts of the Middle East, a group in Judea, and another group in Egypt. This marked the birth of something entirely new in human history: a diaspora people, a nation that could exist without a state, a community that could maintain its identity across continents and centuries. The Jewish diaspora wasn't just about physical displacement. It was about creating a revolutionary new way of being human in the world. The psychological impact was profound. Imagine losing not just your home, but your entire understanding of how the divine world operated. The temple wasn't just a building. It was the place where heaven and earth met, where sacrifices could be offered, where God literally dwelled among the people. Without it, the entire religious and social structure of Jewish life had to be reimagined from scratch. Yet from this crisis emerged innovation. Scholars and scribes began collecting and preserving oral traditions in written form. Laws were codified. Stories were organized. The very texts that would become the Hebrew Bible were shaped by this experience of exile, carrying within them the DNA of a people learning to maintain their identity across distance and time. The Babylonian exile established patterns that would repeat throughout Jewish history: the trauma of displacement, the challenge of maintaining identity in foreign lands, the development of portable traditions that could survive anywhere, and the gradual emergence of new opportunities in places of refuge. But perhaps most importantly, it created the first truly global Jewish community. When Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in 538 BC and allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem, many chose to stay. They had built new lives, established businesses, created communities. The idea of return was appealing in theory, but the reality of Babylon had become home. This choice to remain in the diaspora, even when return became possible, would echo through the centuries. It established the fundamental dynamic of Jewish life, the tension between the pull of the homeland and the reality of life in the wider world. It created a people equally at home everywhere and nowhere, carrying their true homeland not in geography, but in law, custom, and collective memory. The first exile had ended, but the age of diaspora had begun. What started as forced displacement had become a chosen way of life, setting the stage for a pattern of migration and adaptation that would span 2 millennia and transform both the Jewish people and the world they helped to shape. Chapter 3: The Golden Sephardic Age. The year is 1066. While William the Conqueror storms the beaches of England, thousands of miles away in Cordoba, Spain, something equally revolutionary is happening. But instead of conquest, it's creation. Instead of war, it's wisdom. In the courts of Muslim Spain, a Jewish physician named Samuel Hanajid serves as vizier, essentially prime minister, to the ruler of Granada. He commands armies, writes poetry, and oversees one of the most advanced civilizations in medieval Europe. Around him, Jewish scholars, philosophers, poets, and scientists are creating what historians would later call the Spanish Golden Age. The political advice of individuals such as Samuel Hanajid and Hasdi ibn Shapraq contributed to the prosperity and far-reaching cultural and intellectual achievements of the Spanish Islamic Golden Age. Jews continued to play an important political role in Muslim Spain through the twilight of the Emirate of Granada. This was integration unlike anything the world had seen. For over 400 years, from the 8th to the 12th centuries, Jews in Muslim Spain didn't just survive, they flourished beyond their wildest dreams. They weren't merely tolerated. They were essential partners in creating one of history's most sophisticated civilizations. During these centuries of Muslim rule, the local Jewish community flourished. Many of its members assumed senior official positions, while others became prominent sages, biblical commentators, poets, scientists, and thinkers. The names read like a who's who of medieval intellectual life. Maimonides, the greatest Jewish philosopher of the Middle Ages. Solomon ibn Gabriel, whose poetry still echoes in synagogues today. Judah Halevi, whose words captured the Jewish soul like no one before or since. But this wasn't just individual achievement, it was systemic transformation. Spanish Jews, known as Sephardim, developed a unique culture that blended Jewish religious devotion with secular learning, mystical spirituality with practical politics, Hebrew scholarship with Arabic science. They created a synthesis that would influence both Jewish and world culture for centuries to come. The secret ingredient was convivencia, the Spanish term for living together. In the cities of Cordoba, Seville, Granada, and Toledo, Jews, Muslims, and Christians didn't just coexist. They collaborated. They translated each other's books, borrowed each other's ideas, built businesses together, and sometimes even worshipped in the same buildings. Jewish communities grew prosperous, not just economically, but intellectually. They established academies that attracted scholars from across the known world. They developed new forms of Hebrew poetry that incorporated Arabic meters and themes. They created philosophical works that reconciled Aristotelian logic with biblical faith. They wrote scientific treatises that advanced human knowledge in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Jews likely began settling on the Iberian Peninsula at the start of the first millennium of the Common Era. Over the centuries, local Jews experienced many changes and shifts in overlords and ruling entities. By the 15th century, Spanish Jewish communities had become so integral to Iberian culture that they thought of Spain as their true homeland, not just another stop in the diaspora. The success created its own challenges. Prosperity bred both acceptance and resentment. As Jews rose to prominent positions in government, medicine, and trade, they became increasingly visible targets. Christian reconquest of Spain from Muslim rule brought new pressures and new dangers. The Christian monarchs faced a dilemma. Spanish Jews were too valuable economically and intellectually to lose, but too visible and successful to ignore politically. Anti-Jewish sentiment began to grow, fueled by religious zealotry, economic jealousy, and political calculation. The first major crack appeared in 1391. In 1391, thousands of Jews were baptized at Swords Point. These conversos were suspected of continuing to practice Judaism in secret. What followed was a complex dance of conversion, suspicion, and persecution that would ultimately lead to catastrophe. Many Jews converted to Christianity to escape violence, but conversion created new problems. These new Christians, or conversos, found themselves trapped between worlds. Christians suspected them of secretly maintaining Jewish practices, while Jews who remained openly Jewish sometimes viewed them as traitors. The conversos became a distinct community, neither fully Christian nor fully Jewish, but carrying the cultural memory and often the practices of both. To police converso beliefs and practices, Ferdinand and Isabella established the notorious Spanish Inquisition in 1478. What had been a golden age of Jewish life was about to become one of history's most traumatic chapters of persecution and expulsion. The stage was set for a tragedy that would end 15 centuries of Jewish life in Spain and scatter the Sephardic community across the globe. But even as this chapter closed, the cultural and intellectual achievements of Spanish Jewry had already left an indelible mark on world civilization. The cultural and intellectual achievements of Spanish Jewry had already left an indelible mark on world civilization, a legacy that would travel with the expelled communities to every corner of the earth. The Golden Age was ending, but its treasures, intellectual, spiritual, and cultural, would soon enrich Jewish communities from Amsterdam to Istanbul, from Morocco to the Ottoman Empire, wherever the ships and caravans of exile would carry the descendants of Spanish Jewry. Chapter 4. The Spanish Catastrophe. March 31, 1492. In the Alhambra Palace of Granada, Ferdinand and Isabella sign a document that will change the course of world history. The Edict of Expulsion, also known as the Alhambra Decree, gives the Jews of Spain exactly 4 months to make an impossible choice: convert to Christianity or leave forever, abandoning everything they've built over 15 centuries. The vast majority preferred to leave, with all that this entailed in tears, sacrifices, and humiliations, and remain faithful to their faith. They flatly refused the assimilation that was offered them as an alternative. But this wasn't really about choice. It was about the systematic destruction of the most successful Jewish community in medieval Europe. On July 30th of that year, the entire Jewish community, some 200,000 people, were expelled from Spain. The date was chosen deliberately, the 9th of Av, the traditional day of mourning for the destruction of both temples in Jerusalem, The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of refugees died while trying to reach safety. In some instances, Spanish ship captains charged Jewish passengers exorbitant sums, then dumped them overboard in the middle of the ocean. Those who survived the journey faced an uncertain future in lands where they had no connections, no resources, and often no welcome. In the last days before the expulsion, rumors spread throughout Spain that the fleeing refugees had swallowed gold and diamonds, and many Jews were knifed to death by brigands hoping to find treasures in their stomachs. The very people who had helped build Spain's prosperity were now hunted like animals as they tried to escape. What made this expulsion different from previous persecutions was its totality and finality. Another approximately 50,000 Jews received a Christian baptism so as to remain in Spain. Many secretly kept some of their Jewish traditions and thus became the target of the Inquisition. Even conversion could not guarantee safety. The Spanish Inquisition would spend the next several centuries hunting down anyone suspected of secretly maintaining Jewish practices. The economic motive was barely concealed. Dr. M. Kaiserling, Christopher Columbus, writes, "The object was to secure the property of the secret Jews for the state treasury, and to confiscate the property of those who openly professed to be Jews." Ferdinand and Isabella weren't just removing Jews, they were seizing their wealth to fund new ventures, including Columbus's voyage to the Americas. The geographic scope of the resulting diaspora was unprecedented. The Jews of the Kingdom of Castile emigrated mainly to Portugal, where the entire community was forcibly converted in 1497, and to North Africa. The Jews of the Kingdom of Aragon fled to other Christian areas including Italy, rather than to Muslim lands as is often assumed. Portugal offered only temporary refuge. As a condition of the marriage, the Spanish royal family insisted that Portugal expel her Jews. King Manuel agreed, although he was reluctant to lose his affluent and accomplished Jewish community. In the end, only 8 Portuguese Jews were actually expelled. Tens of thousands of others were forcibly converted to Christianity on pain of death. The psychological trauma went far beyond physical displacement. Spanish Jews had thought of themselves as Spanish. They had lived on the Iberian Peninsula longer than many Christian families. They had contributed to Spanish culture, defended Spanish cities, and built Spanish prosperity. Specifically, because their earlier sojourn in that country had been so happy, the Jews regarded the expulsion as a terrible betrayal, and have remembered it ever since with particular bitterness. But from catastrophe came unexpected opportunities. The Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Bayezid II, welcomed Spanish Jewish refugees with open arms. Sultan Bayezid II of the Ottoman Empire, learning about the expulsion of Jews from Spain, dispatched the Ottoman navy to bring the Jews safely to Ottoman lands, mainly to the cities of Thessaloniki, currently in Greece, and Izmir, currently in Turkey. Many of these Jews also settled in other parts of the Balkans ruled by the Ottomans, such as the areas that are now Bulgaria, Serbia, and Bosnia. Bayezid reportedly said, "Those who say that Ferdinand and Isabella are wise are indeed fools, for he gives me, his enemy, his national treasure, the Jews." The Ottoman Sultan understood what the Spanish monarchs had failed to grasp. Jewish communities weren't burdens to be expelled, but assets to be welcomed. The cultural impact was enormous. Kept many of their ancestral customs, and in particular, preserved the use of the Spanish language, a language which, of course, is not exactly what was spoken in 5th century Spain. Like any living language, it evolved and suffered notable alterations over the passage of time, although the structures and essential characteristics remained those of late medieval Castilian. This language, Ladino, or Judeo-Spanish, became the carrier of an entire civilization in exile. The Sephardists never forgot the land of their parents, harboring mixed feelings for her. On the one hand, the resentment for the tragic events of 1492, and on the other hand, as time goes by, the nostalgia for the lost homeland. The Spanish expulsion created a global Sephardic diaspora that would enrich communities from Amsterdam to Istanbul, from Morocco to the New World. These refugees carried with them not just their possessions and traditions, but the accumulated wisdom of centuries of successful integration and adaptation. Spain's loss became the world's gain. The very people Ferdinand and Isabella drove out would go on to build new communities, establish trade networks, and contribute to the prosperity of every country that welcomed them. The Spanish catastrophe had inadvertently created one of history's most successful and influential diaspora communities. Chapter 5. Life in the Pale. The year is 1791. Catherine II of Russia signs a decree that will define Jewish life for the next century and a half. The Pale of Settlement, a vast territory stretching across what we now know as Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Russia, becomes the largest Jewish ghetto in history, home to 5 million people who are forbidden to live anywhere else in the Russian Empire. The Pale of Settlement took away many of the rights that the Jewish people of the late 17th century Russia had enjoyed. At this time, the Jewish people were restricted to an area of what is current-day Belarus, Lithuania, Eastern Poland, and Ukraine. Imagine an entire people confined to a territory roughly the size of Texas, denied the right to live in Moscow, St. Petersburg, or any other major Russian city unless they converted to Orthodox Christianity. This wasn't just geographic restriction, it was economic strangulation. Capitalist development, which commenced at a rapid pace in Russia after the liberation of the serfs in 1861 and also reached Galicia and Austria at about the same time, opened up new sources of livelihood for a small number of Jews, but caused deprivation to greater numbers as it had eradicated many of the traditional occupations. The Pale became a pressure cooker of human potential. 5 million people squeezed into overcrowded towns and villages, competing for limited economic opportunities, creating a world of intense intellectual and cultural activity, born from desperation and determination. In the shtetl, small Jewish towns that dotted the Pale life revolved around study, prayer, and survival. These weren't just communities. They were laboratories of Jewish creativity. The great Talmudic academies of Lithuania produced scholars whose influence would shape Jewish thought for centuries. Hasidic movements emerged, offering mystical alternatives to traditional religious practice. Yiddish literature flourished, creating a rich cultural world that spoke to the daily struggles and dreams of ordinary people. But the walls of the Pale were closing in. The high rate of natural increase created population surpluses that could not be absorbed in the traditional Jewish occupations. Young men and women looked around at their parents' struggles and began to dream of escape, not just from poverty, but from the suffocating restrictions of Russian rule. Then came the pogroms. The assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881 unleashed a wave of state-sponsored violence that would traumatize an entire generation. When the Tsar was assassinated in 1881, the crime was blamed falsely on a Jewish conspiracy, and the government launched a wave of state-sponsored massacres known as pogroms. Hundreds of Jewish villages and neighborhoods were burned by rampaging mobs, and thousands of Jews were slaughtered by Russian soldiers and peasants. The word pogrom comes from the Russian meaning to destroy or to wreak havoc, but these were unspontaneous outbursts of popular anger. They were calculated campaigns of terror designed to keep Jews subjugated and afraid. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 2 million Russian Jewish left Eastern Europe for the United States. The violence followed a predictable pattern. Accusations would spread. Jews had killed a Christian child. Jews were exploiting Christian peasants. Jews were responsible for economic hardship. Mobs would gather, often with the tacit approval of local officials. Synagogues would be burned, businesses looted, families murdered. When it was over, the authorities would express regret, but do nothing to prosecute the perpetrators. The great wave of Jewish migration commenced with the flight from pogroms. In 1881, thousands of Jews fled the towns of the Pale of Settlement in Russia and concentrated in the Austrian border town of Brody in overcrowded conditions and deprivation. The images were heartbreaking. Entire families with whatever possessions they could carry, trudging through mud and snow toward borders they hoped would offer safety. The pogroms were just the most visible form of persecution. Daily life in the Pale was marked by constant discrimination. Where Western Europe was experiencing emancipation at this time, in Russia, the laws for the Jewish people were getting more strict. Jews faced restrictions on education, exclusion from most professions, and the constant threat that new decrees might make their already difficult lives impossible. The psychological impact was perhaps more devastating than the physical violence. A factor of considerable importance in encouraging emigration, even after the first panic of the pogroms had died down, was the disillusionment of the Jews of Russia and Romania with the hope of obtaining legal equality, or at least ameliorating their condition. Young Jews faced an impossible choice: accept a life of limitation and fear, or risk everything on a journey to unknown lands where they might find freedom and opportunity. The decision to leave meant abandoning not just homes and communities, but an entire civilization. The Yiddish-speaking world of Eastern Europe represented 1,000 years of cultural development, its own literature, music, customs, and ways of understanding the world. Yet for millions, the choice became inevitable. The cry "to America" spread across Eastern Europe and launched a massive human migration. Jewish immigrants came to the United States by any possible means, defying the Tsar's laws against emigration. What followed was one of the largest voluntary migrations in human history. But it wasn't just about escaping persecution. It was about pursuing a revolutionary idea. The Jews could be full citizens, not just tolerated minorities. That they could live wherever they chose, work in any profession, send their children to universities, and participate fully in the societies they joined. The Pale of Settlement had been designed to contain Jewish life. Instead, it became the launching pad for Jewish participation in the modern world. The very restrictions that were meant to limit Jewish potential created a generation hungry for freedom, educated enough to succeed, and desperate enough to risk everything for the chance of a better life. Chapter 6: The Great American Escape. Ellis Island, 1907. A teenage girl named Rose clutches her younger brother's hand as they stand in the Great Hall, surrounded by hundreds of other immigrants speaking dozens of languages. She carries a small bundle containing everything she owns: a change of clothes, a photograph of her parents who died in a pogrom, and a piece of paper with her cousin's address on New York's Lower East Side. Rose represents one face of the largest voluntary migration in human history. Behind her in the processing line stands Mendel, a Talmudic scholar from Lithuania who has never seen a building taller than 3 stories. Ahead of her waits Sarah, a seamstress from Kiev whose calloused hands tell the story of 16-hour workdays in her father's tailor shop. Each carries the same hope: that America will offer what Europe never could, the chance to live as a full human being rather than a tolerated stranger. The numbers alone tell an extraordinary story. In the 1880s, more than 200,000 Eastern European Jews arrived in the U.S. In the next decade, the number was over 300,000, and between 1900 and 1914, it topped 1.5 million, most passing through the new immigrant processing center at Ellis Island. This wasn't just migration. It was the transplantation of an entire civilization from the old world to the new. What made this movement unique in human history was its finality and completeness. The Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, however, were different in 2 crucial ways. First, they fled the old country at an astonishing rate. By 1920, more than 1/3 of the Jewish population of the Russian Empire had emigrated. Perhaps more important, Their rate of return migration was close to zero lower than any other major immigrant group. These weren't temporary workers seeking fortune before returning home, like so many Italian or Greek immigrants of the same period. They were refugees from a civilization that had rejected them, burning their bridges behind them as they sought to build entirely new lives in a country that promised equality on the law, something they had never experienced in Europe. The decision to leave wasn't made lightly. Every immigrant had to weigh the unknown dangers of America against the familiar terrors of Europe. Families were torn apart as parents debated whether to risk everything on a dangerous journey or accept the gradual suffocation of life in the Pale. Letters from America painted pictures of opportunity, but also told stories of grinding poverty, dangerous working conditions, and the constant struggle to maintain Jewish identity in a secular society. The numbers correspond directly to waves of persecution in the Old Country. Migration from Russia increased greatly after the expulsion from Moscow in 1891. In the worst pogrom year, from mid-1905 to mid-1906, more than 200,000 Jews emigrated from Russia, 154,000 to the United States, 13,500 to Argentina, 7,000 to Canada, 3,500 to Palestine, and the remainder to South America and several West and Central European countries. America wasn't just an opportunity. It was a lifeline thrown to drowning people. The journey itself was an ordeal that tested human endurance and transformed those who survived it. Jewish immigrants came to the United States by any possible means, defying the Tsar's laws against emigration. The first challenge was simply getting out of the Russian Empire. Jews needed special permits to travel beyond the Pale of Settlement. Bribes had to be paid to officials. Forged documents had to be obtained. Young men had to evade military conscription that could last for 25 years. The overland journey to ports like Hamburg or Bremen often took weeks. Families walked hundreds of miles, carrying children and possessions, sleeping in barns or on the roadside, begging for food from suspicious peasants who saw them as foreign intruders. Many died along the way. Others turned back, defeated by the hardships before they even reached the sea. The ports themselves were often nearly as dangerous as the journey. Hamburg and Bremen became vast refugee camps where thousands of would-be emigrants waited for ships, sometimes for weeks or months. They lived in overcrowded boarding houses, vulnerable to disease, exploitation, and crime. Con artists preyed on their desperation, selling fake tickets or promising services they couldn't deliver. Local authorities treated them as unwanted burdens, barely tolerated while they waited to become someone else's problem. The ocean voyage in steerage class was a nightmare that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Ships designed to carry cargo were hastily converted to transport human beings in conditions that wouldn't have been tolerated for livestock. Families were separated by gender, with men, women, and children assigned to different sections of the ship. Privacy was non-existent. Sanitation was primitive. Disease spread rapidly in the confined spaces. The food was often inedible, especially for observant Jews who tried to maintain kosher dietary laws. Seasickness was universal and debilitating. Storms turned the steerage compartments into hellish chambers where people were thrown about like rag dolls. Many passengers died during the crossing and were buried at sea. Others arrived so weakened by the journey that they couldn't pass the medical examinations at Ellis Island. Yet despite these ordeals, the vast majority of Jewish immigrants successfully completed their journey to America. Their survival rate was actually higher than many other immigrants, perhaps because their desperation left them with no choice but to endure whatever hardships were necessary to reach their destination. Arrival in New York brought its own challenges and revelations. The first sight of the Statue of Liberty moved many immigrants to tears, not just from relief at reaching safety, but from the overwhelming realization that they had actually succeeded in escaping the constraints that had defined their ancestors' lives for centuries. Ellis Island itself was both a gateway to freedom and a final test of worthiness. Immigration officials examined every arrival for signs of disease, mental deficiency, or political radicalism. Those who failed the examinations were sent back to Europe, their dreams shattered after coming so close to success. The fear of rejection created panic among immigrants who had risked everything to reach America. Most immigrants were funneled into the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a neighborhood that became the most densely populated place on Earth. Home to Russian immigrants, New York City's Lower East Side became one of the most densely populated neighborhoods on Earth. Entire families lived in one-room tenement apartments with no running water and limited access to sunlight. Multiple families shared single bathrooms in hallways that reeked of garbage and human waste. The physical conditions were appalling by modern standards, but for people escaping the pogroms and restrictions of Eastern Europe, even slum housing in America represented a form of freedom. Here, Jewish children could attend public schools without religious tests. Jewish men could work in any trade without guilt restrictions. Jewish women could walk the streets without fear of random violence. Yet from this overcrowding and poverty came unexpected vitality and creativity. The Lower East Side became a laboratory of American Jewish life, where old world traditions mixed with new world opportunities to create something entirely novel. Synagogues competed with socialist meeting halls for the loyalty of immigrants, torn between religious tradition and secular modernism. Traditional religious schools operated alongside night schools, teaching English and American customs. Yiddish theaters presented everything from Shakespeare, translated into Jewish vernacular, to original plays about immigrant experiences. Cafes buzzed with political debates conducted in half a dozen languages by revolutionaries who had fled Tsarist persecution. In 1915, the circulation of the daily Yiddish newspapers was 500,000 in New York City alone, and 600,000 nationally. In addition, thousands more subscribed to the numerous weekly Yiddish papers and the many magazines. These publications weren't just sources of news. They were lifelines connecting scattered communities and helping create a new American Jewish identity that balanced ethnic loyalty with American patriotism. The newspapers provided practical information about finding jobs, navigating American bureaucracy, and maintaining Jewish traditions in a secular society. They also served as forums for debate about fundamental questions. Should immigrants try to blend completely into American society or maintain distinct Jewish communities? Should children be encouraged to abandon old world customs or preserve them for future generations? The economic transformation was remarkable and swift. Taking jobs in bustling factories, many as garment workers, Jewish immigrants entered America at the bottom of the economic ladder, but climbed with astonishing speed. The skills they had developed in the Pale literacy, commercial experience, adaptability, served them well in an industrial economy hungry for educated workers. The garment industry became the primary ladder of Jewish economic advancement. Immigrants who had been tailors in Eastern Europe found their skills in high demand in American factories, producing ready-made clothing for the growing middle class. They worked 16-hour days in dangerous conditions, but they earned wages that would have been unimaginable in the old country. More importantly, they saw opportunities for advancement that had been denied to their ancestors. Skilled workers could become supervisors. Supervisors could start their own small factories. Small factory owners could expand into major businesses. Within a generation, Jewish immigrants were establishing department stores, theater chains, and manufacturing companies that employed thousands of other immigrants. The famous rags to riches story of American immigration was nowhere more visible than in the Jewish community. Families that had arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs were sending their children to college within 20 years. Sons of peddlers became doctors and lawyers. Daughters of seamstresses became teachers and social workers. But success came with psychological and social costs that created tensions within families and communities. A further distinguishing feature of Jewish migration was that from the outset, it displayed clearly ideological tendencies. A considerable number of the younger immigrants, members of the intelligentsia, were motivated not only by the desire to find a new refuge or a place in which there were greater chances of success. Their departure constituted a protest against the discrimination and injustices they had suffered in their old homes. The tension between tradition and modernity played out in every Jewish family with an intensity that sometimes led to permanent ruptures. Parents who spoke only Yiddish raised children who preferred English and felt embarrassed by their parents' accents. Fathers who had studied Talmud in traditional schools watched their sons embrace secular education and scientific rationalism. Mothers who had maintained kosher kitchens according to ancient laws sometimes compromised traditional practices to accommodate economic necessity and social pressure. Religious observance became a particular battleground. In the Old Country, Jewish practice had been enforced by community pressure and legal restrictions. In America, observance became a matter of individual choice, and many immigrants chose to abandon rituals that seemed incompatible with American success. The Sabbath was particularly problematic. How could observant Jews compete economically if they refused to work on Saturdays when that was often the busiest day for retail businesses? Intermarriage posed another challenge that would have been unthinkable in the Pale of Settlement. Jewish young people attending American schools and working in American businesses naturally formed friendships and romantic relationships with non-Jewish Americans. Parents who had risked everything to preserve Jewish identity for their children sometimes watched helplessly as those children chose to marry outside the faith. Yet from these tensions and compromises emerged a uniquely American Jewish identity that combined Old World wisdom with New World opportunity. It synthesized traditional values with modern aspirations, ethnic solidarity with American individualism, religious heritage with secular achievement. The immigrants who had fled persecution in Europe were becoming Americans while remaining Jews, a synthesis that seemed impossible in the Old Country, but proved natural in American democratic society. The cultural impact of Jewish immigration extended far beyond the Jewish community itself. Yiddish theater was very well attended and provided a training ground for performers and producers who moved to Hollywood in the 1920s. Jewish entertainers, writers, and intellectuals would play crucial roles in creating American popular culture, from vaudeville to movies to television. The Irving Berlins, George Gershwins, and Samuel Goldwyns who emerged from the Lower East Side would help define American entertainment for the entire world. The songs they wrote, the films they produced, and the stories they told became part of the global American cultural export that shaped international perceptions of American values and aspirations. Jewish immigrants also played disproportionate roles in American labor movements, civil rights campaigns, and social reform efforts. Having experienced persecution themselves, many Jewish Americans became passionate advocates for equality and social justice. They founded settlement houses, supported women's suffrage, and helped organize labor unions that protected all workers, regardless of ethnicity or religion. The Great American Escape wasn't just about individual success. It represented the transformation of an entire people from medieval subjects to modern citizens. Jews who had been restricted to ghettos in Europe were becoming full participants in American democracy. They were attending universities that had once excluded them, entering professions that had been closed to them, starting businesses that competed in open markets, and participating in political processes as equals rather than supplicants. Yet even as they celebrated their American success, the immigrants couldn't forget what they had left behind. Letters from relatives still trapped in Europe brought news of continued persecution and economic hardship. Money was regularly sent back to help family members escape or survive. The success of American Jews created both obligation and guilt obligation to help those still suffering in the old country, and guilt about their own good fortune in the face of others' continued misery. This dynamic would become crucial as new and even more terrible threats emerged in Europe during the 1930s. The very success of the American Jewish community would position it to play a vital role in attempting to rescue European Jews from the greatest catastrophe in Jewish history. The immigrants who had escaped the pogroms would find themselves in a position to help their children and grandchildren survive the Holocaust. But first, those European communities had to survive the rising tide of hatred that was already gathering strength across the Atlantic, threatening to engulf not just Eastern European Jewish communities, but the entire Jewish population of Europe. Next decade, the number was over 300,000, and between 1900 and 1914, it topped 1.5 million, most passing through the new immigrant processing center at Ellis Island. What made this migration unique was its finality. The Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, however, were different in two crucial ways. First, they fled the old country at an astonishing rate. By 1920, more than one-third of the Jewish population of the Russian Empire had emigrated. Perhaps more important, their rate of return migration was close to zero, lower than any other major immigrant group. These weren't temporary workers seeking fortune before returning home. They were refugees from a civilization that had rejected them, seeking to build new lives in a country that promised equality under law, something they had never experienced in Europe. The numbers tell the story of desperation and hope. Each spike in immigration corresponded to a new wave of persecution in the old country. America wasn't just an opportunity, it was a lifeline. The journey itself was an ordeal that tested human endurance. Jewish immigrants came to the United States by any possible means, defying the Tsar's laws against emigration. They traveled on foot to ports like Hamburg or Bremen, often spending weeks in overcrowded boarding houses waiting for ships. The ocean voyage in steerage class was a nightmare of seasickness, disease, and fear. But arrival in New York brought its own challenges. Most immigrants were funneled into the Lower East Side, a neighborhood that became the most densely populated place on Earth. Home to Russian immigrants, New York City's Lower East Side became one of the most densely populated neighborhoods on Earth. Entire families lived in one-room tenement apartments. Multiple families shared single bathrooms. Streets that had housed thousands now sheltered tens of thousands. Yet from this overcrowding came unexpected vitality. The Lower East Side became a laboratory of American Jewish life. Synagogues competed with socialist meeting halls. Traditional religious schools operated alongside secular night schools teaching English and American customs. Yiddish newspapers flourished, keeping immigrants connected to each other and to events in the old country while helping them navigate their new world. In 1915, the circulation of the daily Yiddish newspapers was 500,000 in New York City alone, and 600,000 nationally. In addition, thousands more subscribed to the numerous weekly Yiddish papers and the many magazines. These weren't just newspapers. They were lifelines connecting scattered communities and helping create a new American Jewish identity. The economic transformation was remarkable. Taking jobs in bustling factories, many as garment workers, Jewish immigrants entered America at the bottom of the economic ladder, but climbed with remarkable speed. The skills they had developed in the Pale literacy, commercial experience, adaptability served them well in an industrial economy hungry for educated workers. Within a generation, Jewish immigrants were establishing businesses, sending their children to universities, and participating in American political life in ways that would have been impossible in Europe. The famous rags to riches story of American immigration was nowhere more visible than in the Jewish community. But success came with costs. A further distinguishing feature of Jewish migration was that from the outset, it displayed clearly ideological tendencies. A considerable number of the younger immigrants, Members of the intelligentsia were motivated not only by the desire to find a new refuge or a place in which there were greater chances of success. Their departure constituted a protest against the discrimination and injustices they had suffered in their old homes. The tension between tradition and modernity played out in every Jewish family. Parents who spoke Yiddish raised children who dreamed in English. Fathers who had studied Talmud in traditional schools watched their sons become doctors, lawyers, and businessmen. Mothers who had kept kosher kitchens in the old country sometimes struggled to maintain religious observance in the face of economic necessity and social pressure. Yet from this tension emerged a uniquely American Jewish identity. It combined Old World wisdom with New World opportunity, traditional values with modern aspirations, ethnic solidarity with American individualism. The immigrants who had fled persecution in Europe were becoming Americans while remaining Jews, a synthesis that seemed impossible in the old country, but proved natural in America. The cultural impact extended far beyond the Jewish community. Yiddish theater was very well attended and provided a training ground for performers and producers who moved to Hollywood in the 1920s. Jewish entertainers, writers, and intellectuals would play crucial roles in creating American popular culture, from vaudeville to Hollywood to Broadway to television. The Great American Escape wasn't just about individual success, it was about the transformation of an entire people. Jews who had been restricted to ghettos in Europe were becoming full participants in American society. They were attending universities, entering professions, starting businesses, and helping to build the American dream, not just for themselves, but for all immigrants who followed. Yet even as they celebrated their American success, the immigrants couldn't forget what they had left behind. Letters from the old country brought news of continued persecution. Money was sent back to help relatives escape or survive. The success of American Jews created both obligation and guilt obligation to help those still trapped in Europe, and guilt about their own good fortune in the face of others' continued suffering. This dynamic would become crucial as new threats emerged in Europe. The very success of the American Jewish community would position it to play a vital role in rescuing European Jews from the greatest catastrophe in Jewish history. But first, those communities had to survive the rising tide of hatred that was already gathering strength across the Atlantic. Chapter 7. The Nazi Nightmare. Berlin, January 30th, 1933. As Adolf Hitler is sworn in as Chancellor of Germany, Jewish families across Europe are making calculations that will determine whether they live or die. Dr. Kurt Klein, a successful businessman in Kleinerdlingen, Germany, sits at his dinner table with his wife and young son, trying to decide whether the anti-Semitic rhetoric is temporary political theater or an existential threat to their family's survival. Within months, their world begins to collapse. The Nazi policy was initially designed to encourage Jewish emigration through systematic persecution. The boycott of Jewish businesses, the exclusion from professions, the Nuremberg Laws of 1935 that stripped Jews of citizenship, all were intended to make life so unbearable that Jews would voluntarily leave Germany. The Nuremberg Laws, introduced in 1935, denied Jews their German citizenship, forbade Jews to marry non-Jews, and took away most of their political rights. Jews became scapegoats for everything that had happened to Germany over the previous decades. The loss of World War I, the punitive Treaty of Versailles, inflation, and economic depression. But immigration required more than the desire to leave, it required somewhere to go. As Nazi persecution intensified, an agonizing reality became clear. The world's doors were slamming shut just as German and Austrian Jews desperately needed them to open. Dr. Klein's family represents the tragic dilemma facing European Jews. As Nazi anti-Jewish policy intensified, Kurt's family decided to leave Germany. Kurt left for the United States in 1937, but his parents were unable to leave before the outbreak of World War II. Kurt's parents were eventually deported to Auschwitz, in German-occupied Poland. The bureaucratic nightmare of escape became as deadly as the political persecution. An immigrant applying for admission to another country had to present all sorts of documents and pieces of evidence. For many people, this was an insurmountable obstacle. Even when Jews had the papers, visas, and sponsors required for immigration, the process could take months or years' time that many didn't have. The November 1938 Kristallnacht pogrom marked a turning point. During this wave of violence organized by the state against the Jews, more than 100 Jews were murdered and 30,000 Jewish men were imprisoned in concentration camps. Thousands of synagogues, Jewish shops, schools, cemeteries, and hospitals were destroyed or set on fire. The international response was sympathy without action. At the Bermuda Conference in April 1943, the Allies offered no concrete proposals for rescue. Switzerland took in approximately 30,000 Jews, but turned back about the same number at the border. About 100,000 Jews reached the Iberian Peninsula. Spain took in a limited number of refugees and then speedily sent them on to the Portuguese port of Lisbon. The statistics reveal the scope of international indifference. The United States had about 27,000 available visas in late 1938 for individuals for refugees. This was far more than the U.S. would allow into the country due to its immigration policy. The MS St. Louis sailed from Hamburg, Germany for Cuba, who had issued transit visas for more than 900 Jewish refugees on a voyage that occurred from May to June 1939. Once the ship had arrived, the Cubans canceled the refugees' visas. The ship was denied permission to land in the United States and Canada, and it had to make a return voyage to Europe. Even children found few places of refuge. Great Britain itself limited its own intake of immigrants in 1938-1939, though the British government did permit the entry of some 10,000 Jewish children in a special Kindertransport, children's transport program. These children were saved, but they would never see their parents again. As war engulfed Europe, escape became virtually impossible. By October 1941, when Jewish emigration was officially forbidden, what followed was industrialized genocide on a scale history had never seen. The Holocaust was Nazi Germany's deliberate, organized, state-sponsored persecution and genocide of approximately 6 million European Jews. Entire communities that had existed for centuries were wiped from the map. The Yiddish-speaking world of Eastern Europe, with its scholars, artists, musicians, and ordinary families, was systematically murdered. The few who escaped carried unimaginable trauma. In 1942, Kurt joined the United States Army and was trained in military intelligence. In Europe, he interrogated prisoners of war. In May 1945, he took part in the surrender of a village in Czechoslovakia and returned the next day to assist over 100 Jewish women who had been abandoned there during a death march. Kurt's future wife, Gerda, was one of the women in this group. These survivors faced a world that struggled to comprehend what they had endured. Many discovered that their entire families, their communities, their entire worlds had been erased. They were not just refugees. They were the remnants of a destroyed civilization, carrying within them the memories of communities that no longer existed. The Nazi nightmare had accomplished something no previous persecution had achieved. It had nearly succeeded in destroying European Jewish life entirely. But from the ashes of this catastrophe would emerge both a new determination to create a Jewish homeland and a global recognition that never again couldn't remain just a slogan. It had to become a commitment, backed by action and institutions capable of protecting human dignity. Chapter 8. Displaced Persons and New Beginnings. Bergen-Belsen, Germany, April 1945. British soldiers entering the concentration camp are overwhelmed by what they find. Thousands of barely living skeletons, mountains of corpses, and among the survivors, people who no longer remember their own names. But within months, these same barracks that had housed Nazi victims are transformed into something unprecedented. Displaced persons camps where survivors begin the seemingly impossible task of rebuilding human civilization from nothing. Following the German occupation of her hometown in 1939, Lisa and her family moved first to Augusto and then to Slonim in Soviet-occupied eastern Poland. German troops captured Slonim in June 1941. During the invasion of the Soviet Union, Lisa eventually escaped from Slonim and went first to Grodno and then to Vilna, where she joined the resistance movement. She joined a partisan group, fighting the Germans from bases in the Narok forest. Lisa's story represents the experience of hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors who, by 1945, found themselves in Allied-controlled territories with no homes to return to. From 1945 to 1952, more than 250,000 Jewish displaced persons DPS lived in camps and urban centers in Germany, Austria, and Italy. These facilities were administered by Allied authorities and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA. The irony was bitter. Jewish survivors were housed in Germany, the very country that had tried to exterminate them. Many of the DP camps were former concentration camps and German army camps. The survivors had been liberated from Nazi control, only to find themselves once again behind barbed wire, dependent on others for their most basic needs. But something remarkable happened in these camps. Despite the often bleak conditions, Jewish displaced persons began creating new communities from the fragments of destroyed ones. Schools were soon established, and teachers came from Israel and the United States to teach the children in the DP camps. Orthodox Judaism also began its rebirth as yeshivat religious schools were founded in several camps, including Bergen-Belsen, Farnwald, and Feldafing. The camps became laboratories of Jewish renewal. Religious holidays became major occasions for gatherings and celebrations. Jewish volunteer agencies supplied religious articles for everyday and holiday use. The DPs also transformed the camps into active cultural and social centers. Journalism sprang to life with more than 170 publications. Marriage and family formation took on special significance. Photograph taken during the wedding of Ibby Newman and Max Mandel at the Bad Reichenhall displaced persons camp. Germany, February 22, 1948. For people who had lost everything, family, community, identity, creating new families became an act of defiance against the Nazi goal of Jewish extermination. The political situation was complex and often frustrating. At the end of 1946, the number of Jewish DPs was estimated at 250,000, of whom 185,000 were in Germany, 45,000 in Austria, and 20,000 in Italy. Most Jewish DPs preferred to emigrate to Palestine, but many also sought entry into the United States. They decided to remain in the DP camps until they could leave Europe. But leaving proved difficult. Immigration to Palestine, Aliyah, remained severely limited until the establishment of the State of Israel in May 1948. Thousands of Jewish displaced persons sought to enter Palestine illegally between 1945 and 1948. The British authorities interned many of these would-be immigrants to Palestine in detention camps on Cyprus. The Harrison Report, commissioned by President Truman, offered scathing criticism of the DP's treatment. He described crowded and unsanitary conditions in the DP camps. He also offered recommendations for improving conditions for Jewish DPs. Lastly, Harrison urged quick action to resettle the Jewish refugee population. Most Jewish DPs, he noted, wished to go to mandatory Palestine. American pressure eventually opened new possibilities. The United States admitted 400,000 displaced persons between 1945 and 1952. Approximately 96,000, roughly 24% of them were Jews who had survived the Holocaust. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 created a pathway for Holocaust survivors to enter America, though the process remained slow and bureaucratic. The establishment of Israel in May 1948 transformed the situation dramatically. With the establishment of Israel in May 1948, Jewish refugees began streaming into that new sovereign state. Some 140,000 Holocaust survivors entered Israel during the next few years. For the first time in 2,000 years, Jews could go to a country where they would be the majority, where they could rebuild their lives without fear of persecution. As part of the Briha, flight, escape, movement of 250,000 Jewish Holocaust survivors from Eastern Europe, Lisa and her husband Aaron sought to leave Europe. Unable to enter Palestine, they eventually settled in the United States. The Briha was both a practical operation to help survivors escape Europe and a symbolic statement that the age of Jewish powerlessness was ending. The DP experience created a generation of survivors who understood that security required more than individual success. It required collective strength. These survivors would become foundational figures in both the State of Israel and in strengthening Jewish communities worldwide. They carried with them not just trauma but determination, not just loss but the will to rebuild. With over 80,000 Jewish DPs in the United States, about 136,000 in Israel, and another 20,000 in other nations, including Canada and South Africa, the DP emigration crisis came to an end. Almost all of the DP camps were closed by 1,952. The Jewish displaced persons began new lives in their new homelands around the world. But these weren't just individual success stories. They were the seeds of Jewish renewal after the greatest catastrophe in Jewish history. The displaced persons who survived the camps would help create the State of Israel, strengthen American Jewish institutions, and establish new Jewish communities around the world. From the depths of despair, they had created the foundation for Jewish Renaissance. Chapter 9. The founding of Israel Tel Aviv, May 14, 1948. At exactly 4 p.m., David Ben-Gurion stands before a small gathering in the Tel Aviv Museum and reads a 979-word declaration that will change the course of Jewish history forever. The State of Israel will be established. After 1,878 years of exile, the Jewish people have a homeland again. But this moment didn't emerge from nowhere. It was the culmination of decades of migration, struggle, and determination by Jews who refused to accept that homelessness was their permanent condition. In the late 19th century, a new Jewish political movement called Zionism was founded to advocate for this goal. The Zionist movement became increasingly popular in Europe after World War I, as the rise of new anti-Jewish political movements and policies intensified persecution. The early Zionist settlers, beginning with the arrival of the Beluim from Russia in 1882, were driven by a revolutionary idea that Jews could reclaim their ancient homeland and become farmers, soldiers, and builders rather than remain confined to the commercial roles European societies had forced upon them. The waves of Aliyah, immigration to Israel, tell the story of Jewish determination in the face of seemingly impossible odds. In 1872, colonies were established at Petah Tikva and Rosh Pina. Jewish settlement in Jaffa may be dated to 1820, when Isaiah Egeman moved there from Istanbul. These weren't just individual adventures. They were part of a growing movement to create a new Jew who could defend himself and work his own land. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 seemed to offer international recognition of Jewish claims to Palestine. But implementing that promise proved far more difficult than issuing it. British control of Palestine brought both opportunity and restriction, support and betrayal. The British found themselves trapped between competing promises to Jews and Arabs, trying to maintain imperial control while managing explosive national aspirations. immigration increased dramatically during the Nazi period, as European Jews fled persecution. But British restrictions, designed to appease Arab opposition, turned potential immigrants into illegal refugees. Despite British restrictions, limited numbers of Jews entered Palestine during the war through illegal immigration, Aliyah bet. The Holocaust transformed the moral landscape surrounding Jewish statehood. During the Holocaust, the Nazis and their allies and collaborators murdered 6 million Jewish men, women, and children. They destroyed centuries of Jewish life in Europe and thousands of Jewish communities. In the aftermath of this genocide, it became clear to many Holocaust survivors and other Jews that Jews needed their own country where they could live in safety and independence. The arrival of Holocaust survivors intensified both the urgency and the complexity of the situation. Most Jewish DPs preferred to emigrate to Palestine, but many also sought entry into the United States. The sight of Holocaust survivors being turned away from Palestine and interned in Cyprus camps created international pressure on Britain to change its policies. In 1945 reports of the Holocaust, with its 6 million Jewish killed, caused many Jews in Palestine to turn openly against the British mandate, and illegal immigration escalated rapidly as many Holocaust survivors joined the Aliyah. After Aliyah bet, the process of numbering or naming individual Aliyah ceased, but immigration did not. The United Nations Partition Plan of November 1947 offered a compromise: divide Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. While Jewish leaders accepted the plan despite its limitations, Arab leaders rejected it entirely, promising to prevent its implementation by force. When Ben-Gurion finished reading the Declaration of Independence, the response was immediate and global. President Truman recognized the new state within minutes. But so did 5 Arab armies that invaded the next day, determined to strangle the Jewish state at birth. What followed was Israel's War of Independence, a conflict that would determine whether the Jewish return to Zion would succeed or end in catastrophe. Against overwhelming odds, the new state not only survived, but prevailed. The victory wasn't just military, it was psychological. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, Jews had defended their own land with their own army. A major wave of Jewish immigration, mainly from post-Holocaust Europe and the Arab and Muslim world, took place from 1948 to 1951. In 3.5 years, the Jewish population of Israel, which was 650,000 at the state's founding, was more than doubled by an influx of about 688,000 immigrants. In 1949, the largest ever number of Jewish immigrants in a single year, 249,954, arrived in Israel. This period of immigration is often termed kibbutz galuyot, literally, ingathering of exiles, due to the large number of Jewish diaspora communities that made Aliyah. Operation Magic Carpet, 1949 to 1950, brought nearly the entire community of Yemenite Jews, about 49,000, to Israel. From 1948 until the early 1970s, around 900,000 Jews from Arab lands left, fled, or were expelled from various Arab nations, of which an estimated 650,000 settled in Israel. The establishment of Israel solved one set of problems while creating others. Sephardic Jews from North Africa and the Middle East, Ashkenazi survivors from Europe, and long-established Palestinian Jewish communities had to be forged into a single nation. Different languages, customs, and expectations had to be harmonized. Refugee camps had to be transformed into permanent communities. But perhaps most significantly, Israel's founding changed the fundamental dynamic of Jewish life worldwide. For the first time in nearly 2 millennia, diaspora Jews weren't just scattered refugees. They were citizens of other countries who also had a homeland, a place where they could always go if persecution arose, a state that could speak for Jewish interests on the world stage. The law of return that was passed by the Israeli parliament in 1950 gives all diaspora Jews, as well as their children and grandchildren, the right to relocate to Israel and acquire Israeli citizenship on the basis of connecting to their Jewish identity. This wasn't just legislation, it was a promise that homelessness would never again be the Jewish condition. The founding of Israel didn't end Jewish migration, it transformed it. No longer were Jews simply fleeing persecution or seeking opportunity. Now they could also choose to participate in building a Jewish state, to be part of the greatest return migration in human history. Chapter 10. Modern Migrated, New York, 1991. As the Soviet Union collapses, Zhana Nemtsova steps off an airplane at JFK Airport clutching her violin case and a bag containing everything she owns. She's part of the largest Jewish migration since the Holocaust, over 1 million Soviet Jews fleeing the remnants of an empire that had imprisoned them for 70 years. But unlike previous migrations driven by persecution, this movement is powered by newfound freedom and the dream of unlimited possibilities. Zhana's story begins not with pogroms or persecution, but with the unexpected collapse of restrictions that had defined Soviet Jewish life for decades. As a child in Leningrad, she had been denied admission to the city's prestigious conservatory because of unofficial quotas limiting Jewish enrollment. Her parents, both accomplished musicians, had been forced to hide their Jewish identity to advance their careers. Hebrew was banned. Synagogues were closed. Contact with Israel was forbidden. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika opened doors that have been sealed for generations. Jewish cultural organizations emerged from underground. Hebrew classes began meeting openly. Applications for emigration once a one-way ticket to prison became routine bureaucratic processes. The fall of communism opened floodgates that had been sealed for generations. Since the founding of the State of Israel, the Jewish Agency for Israel was mandated as the organization responsible for Aliyah in the diaspora. Between 1989 and 2006, nearly 1 million Soviet Jews immigrated to Israel, transforming both the immigrants and their new homeland. But Israel wasn't the only destination. Approximately 350,000 Soviet Jews immigrated to the United States during the same period, with smaller numbers settling in Germany, Canada, and other countries. This dispersal reflected a fundamental change in Jewish migration patterns. For the first time in history, Jewish refugees had multiple viable options and could choose their destination based on personal preference rather than desperate necessity. The Soviet Jewish migration revealed how different Jewish movement had become in the late 20th century. These weren't desperate flights from immediate physical danger, but calculated decisions to pursue better opportunities in societies that offered greater freedom and prosperity. Soviet Jews could take time to research their options, learn destination, languages, and prepare for their transitions in ways that previous generations of Jewish refugees never could. The migration also highlighted the diversity within the Jewish world. Many Soviet Jews have been completely cut off from Jewish religious and cultural life for 3 generations. They identified as Jewish ethnically, but knew little about Jewish religious practices, Hebrew language, or traditional customs. Their integration into Jewish communities in Israel and America required them to learn about traditions their grandparents had been forced to abandon. But this wasn't the only major migration reshaping modern Jewish life in the post-Cold War era. In Venezuela, growing anti-Semitism in the country, including anti-Semitic violence, caused an increasing number of Jews to move to Israel during the 2000s. For the first time in Venezuelan history, Jews began leaving for Israel in the hundreds. By November 2010, more than half of Venezuela's 20,000-strong Jewish community had left the country. The Venezuelan Jewish exodus illustrates how political instability and economic crisis can rapidly transform thriving Jewish communities. Venezuela had been home to Jews for over a century, with many families achieving remarkable success in business, medicine, and the professions. The community had built synagogues, schools, and cultural institutions that served as models for Jewish life throughout Latin America. But Hugo Chávez's rise to power in 1999 marked the beginning of a dramatic deterioration in Jewish security and opportunity. Government-sponsored anti-Semitic rhetoric increased dramatically. Jewish businesses were targeted for nationalization. Synagogues and schools faced bomb threats and actual attacks. The economic crisis that accompanied political upheaval made normal business operations increasingly difficult. The decision to leave Venezuela wasn't easy for families that had considered themselves fully Venezuelan for generations. Many spoke Spanish as their first language and had stronger emotional connections to Caracas than to Jerusalem or New York. They owned businesses, homes, and had extensive networks of friends and professional contacts. Leaving meant abandoning not just property, but identity as Venezuelan Jews. Argentina's economic crisis of 2001-2002 triggered another significant wave of Jewish migration, though for different reasons. During 2002 and 2003, the Jewish Agency for Israel launched an intensive public campaign to promote Aliyah from the region and offered additional economic aid for immigrants from Argentina. The Argentine community in Israel is about 50,000 to 70,000 people, the largest Latin American group in the country. The Argentine situation differed from Venezuela because it was primarily economic rather than anti-Semitic. Argentina had one of the world's largest Jewish communities outside of Israel and the United States, with a vibrant cultural life and minimal anti-Semitism. But the economic collapse of 2001 wiped out middle-class savings, destroyed businesses, and created massive unemployment that affected Jewish families along with all other Argentines. For many Argentine Jews, emigration represented an economic opportunity rather than an escape from persecution. They could use their education, professional skills, and family connections to rebuild their lives in countries with more stable economies. Israel offered immediate citizenship and absorption programs. The United States provided established Jewish communities and economic opportunities. Some families split their time between countries, maintaining businesses or properties in Argentina while establishing residence elsewhere. These modern migrations reveal how profoundly Jewish movement has evolved in the contemporary world. Unlike the desperate flights from persecution that characterized earlier eras, contemporary Jewish migration often involves choice between multiple attractive options. Economic opportunity, political stability, educational possibilities, and quality of life considerations all factor into decisions that previous generations had to make based purely on survival. French Jewish immigration to Israel increased dramatically after 2000, driven by rising anti-Semitism and terrorist attacks. The 2015 attacks on the Hypercacher kosher supermarket and other incidents convinced many French Jews that Europe was becoming unsafe again. French Jews now constitute one of the largest immigrant groups in modern Israel, with approximately 50,000 having made Aliyah since 2000. The French situation is particularly complex because it involves one of Europe's oldest and most successful Jewish communities. French Jews had achieved remarkable integration into French society since their emancipation during the French Revolution. They had produced prominent political leaders, intellectuals, artists, and business leaders. Many families had lived in France for centuries and considered themselves as French as any other citizens. But the growth of Islamic extremism and anti-Israeli sentiment created new forms of anti-Semitism that made many French Jews question their future in France. Attacks on Jewish schools, synagogues, and individuals became increasingly common. Jewish children faced harassment in public schools. Jewish-owned businesses were targeted for boycotts and vandalism. The decision to leave France for Israel involved profound cultural adjustments. French Jews had to learn Hebrew, adapt to Middle Eastern climate and culture, and often accept lower status employment while they rebuilt their careers. Many struggled with the transition from European sophistication to what they perceived as Israeli informality and chaos. Technology has fundamentally transformed the modern migration experience. Where previous generations lost touch with families and communities they left behind, modern migrants maintain constant contact through internet, social media, and affordable international travel. Migration no longer means severing connections. It means expanding them across multiple countries and cultures. WhatsApp groups connect extended families across continents. Skype enables grandparents to participate in grandchildren's daily lives despite living thousands of miles away. Social media allows immigrants to maintain connections with friends and communities in their countries of origin while building new relationships in their destinations. This connectivity has created new forms of Jewish identity that transcend traditional geographic boundaries. Modern Jewish professionals might live in New York, maintain business relationships in London, send their children to Jewish summer camps in Israel, and regularly visit aging parents in Buenos Aires. Their Jewish identity incorporates elements from multiple cultures and countries rather than being rooted in any single location. The success of modern Jewish migrations has created new challenges and opportunities for Jewish communities worldwide. Israel must integrate immigrants from dozens of countries, speaking different languages and coming from radically different economic and social systems. The absorption of Ethiopian Jews through operations Moses and Solomon brought ancient Jewish communities that had been isolated for centuries into contact with modern Israeli society. American Jewish communities have had to adapt to waves of immigrants with different customs, languages, and expectations. Persian Jews from Iran brought distinctive traditions and business practices. Syrian Jews from Brooklyn created insular communities that maintain Middle Eastern customs while achieving remarkable economic success. Russian Jews often struggled with religious observance, but excelled in science, technology, and the professions. But migration flows in the modern world aren't unidirectional. Some Israeli immigrants, known as Yordim, leave Israel for opportunities in America, Europe, or elsewhere. This phenomenon challenges traditional Zionist assumptions about the centrality of Israel in Jewish life and reflects the complexity of identity in a globalized world where people can maintain connections to multiple countries simultaneously. The digital age has also created virtual Jewish communities that transcend geography entirely. Online learning programs connect Jews in remote locations with teachers and communities worldwide. Young Jews in small towns can participate in Jewish life through internet platforms that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Social media enables Jewish communities in different countries to share experiences and support each other in real time. Climate change and political instability create new pressures for migration that affect Jewish communities worldwide. Australian Jews debate whether extreme weather events and environmental degradation make long-term residence viable in their increasingly inhospitable continent. South African Jews continue leaving due to crime, economic uncertainty, and political instability that threaten their security and prosperity. Turkish Jews face growing pressure from increasingly authoritarian government policies and rising anti-Semitism. In a country that had been relatively tolerant for centuries, many are exploring options for immigration to Israel, the United States, or European countries that offer greater political stability and religious freedom. Modern Jewish migration also reveals both continuities and dramatic changes in the Jewish historical experience. The fundamental desire for security, opportunity, and community remains constant across the centuries. Jews continue to move in search of places where they can practice their religion freely, educate their children successfully, and build prosperous lives without fear of persecution. But the options available to contemporary Jews seeking better lives have expanded exponentially. They can choose between multiple countries that welcome Jewish immigrants. They can maintain connections across vast distances. They can preserve their cultural identities while adapting to new societies. They can contribute to multiple communities simultaneously rather than being forced to choose between old and new loyalties. The challenges also persist in new forms. Assimilation pressures that once operated at the local community level now operate globally through digital media and popular culture. Young Jews growing up in small communities have unprecedented access to the wider world, but may feel less connected to local Jewish institutions and traditions. The ease of global communication sometimes reduces motivation for face-to-face community involvement and relationship building. Rising anti-Semitism in various forms continues to threaten Jewish security despite overall improvements in Jewish status. Worldwide, social media amplifies ancient hatreds while creating new platforms for discrimination and harassment. Political polarization in many countries creates environments where Jewish communities become scapegoats for complex social and economic problems. Yet, Jewish communities have developed sophisticated responses to contemporary challenges. Holocaust. Education programs ensure that historical lessons are preserved and transmitted to new generations. Anti-defamation organizations monitor incidents and advocate for Jewish rights. Security measures protect Jewish institutions, while community leaders work to build bridges with other religious and ethnic groups. The State of Israel remains central to modern Jewish migration patterns, both as a destination and as a psychological safety net that provides security even for Jews who never intend to emigrate there. The promise of the law of return that any Jew can become an Israeli citizen offers reassurance that homelessness need never again be the Jewish condition, even for Jews who are fully integrated into diaspora societies. As we move further into the 21st century, Jewish migration patterns continue to evolve in response to changing global conditions. Economic opportunities in emerging markets attract Jewish entrepreneurs and professionals. Educational possibilities draw Jewish families to countries with excellent schools and universities. Cultural attractions bring Jews to places where they can participate in vibrant Jewish communities while pursuing diverse personal and professional interests. Climate change, technological advancement, political upheaval, and economic transformation will undoubtedly create new pressures and opportunities that reshape Jewish migration in ways we cannot yet predict. But the fundamental Jewish experience of movement, of leaving one place to build a better life in another, remains as relevant today as it was when the first exiles walked from Jerusalem to Babylon over 2.5 millennia ago. The difference is that modern Jewish migrants move not as desperate refugees, but as global citizens with choices, connections, and opportunities that their ancestors could never have imagined. They carry with them not just the trauma of historical persecution, but the confidence that comes from knowing they belong to communities and societies that value their contributions and respect their rights as equals. These modern migrations reveal how different Jewish movement has become in the 21st century. Unlike the desperate flights from persecution that characterized earlier eras, contemporary Jewish migration often involves choice between multiple options. Soviet Jews could choose between Israel, America, Germany, or other destinations. Argentine Jews could move to Israel, remain in Argentina, or relocate to other countries in the Americas or Europe. The motivations have evolved as well. Economic opportunity, political instability, anti-Semitism, and Zionist conviction all play roles, but so do quality of life considerations, educational opportunities for children, and the desire to live in communities with strong Jewish institutions. Modern Jewish migrants aren't just fleeing, they're choosing. Technology has transformed the migration experience itself. Where previous generations lost touch with families and communities they left behind, modern migrants maintain constant contact through internet, social media, and affordable international travel. Migration no longer means severing connections. It means expanding them. The success of modern migrations has created new challenges and opportunities. Israel must integrate immigrants from dozens of countries, speaking different languages and coming from radically different economic and social systems. The absorption of Ethiopian Jews through operations. Moses and Solomon brought ancient Jewish communities that have been isolated for centuries into contact with modern Israeli society. French Jewish immigration to Israel increased dramatically after 2000, driven by rising anti-Semitism and terrorist attacks. The 2015 attacks on the hypercarcher, kosher supermarket, and other incidents convinced many French Jews that Europe was becoming unsafe again. French Jews now constitute one of the largest immigrant groups in modern Israel, but migration flows aren't unidirectional. Some Israeli immigrants, known as Yordim, leave Israel for opportunities in America, Europe, or elsewhere. The phenomenon challenges traditional Zionist assumptions about the centrality of Israel in Jewish life and reflects the complexity of identity in a globalized world. American Jewish migration patterns have also shifted. While the great wave of Eastern European immigration ended in the 1920s, new migrations brought Persian Jews fleeing the Iranian Revolution, Syrian Jews leaving political instability, and Russian Jews seeking freedom after the Soviet collapse. Each wave brought distinct traditions, languages, and customs that enriched American Jewish life while creating new challenges of integration and community building. The digital age has created virtual Jewish communities that transcend geography entirely. Online learning programs connect Jews in remote locations with teachers and communities worldwide. Social media enables Jewish communities in different countries to share experiences and support each other in ways that would have been impossible for previous generations. Climate change and political instability create new pressures for migration that affect Jewish communities worldwide. Australian Jews debate whether extreme weather events make long-term residence viable. South African Jews continue leaving due to crime and economic uncertainty. Turkish Jews face political pressure in an increasingly authoritarian state. Modern Jewish migration reveals both continuities and changes in the Jewish experience. The desire for security, opportunity, and community remains constant. The ability to maintain connections across distances has been revolutionized. The options available to Jews seeking better lives have expanded dramatically. Yet challenges remain. Rising anti-Semitism in Europe and political polarization worldwide create new uncertainties. Young Jews in many countries feel increasingly disconnected from traditional Jewish institutions and may choose to migrate in search of more vibrant Jewish communities. The State of Israel remains central to modern Jewish migration patterns, both as a destination and as a guarantee that homelessness need never again be the Jewish condition. The promise of the law of return that any Jew can become an Israeli citizen provides psychological security even for those who never intend to. Use it. As we enter the third decade of the 21st century, Jewish migration continues to evolve. Climate change, technological advancement, political upheaval, and economic transformation will create new pressures and opportunities. But the fundamental Jewish experience of movement, of leaving one place to build a better life in another, remains as relevant today as it was when the first exiles walked from Jerusalem to Babylon 2,600 years ago. Chapter 11. The Global Jewish Renaissance ANC, London, 2023. Sarah Kleinamy, a tech entrepreneur whose great-grandmother fled the Russian pogroms, whose grandmother survived the Holocaust in hiding, and whose parents immigrated to America in the 1950s, is launching a startup that connects Jewish communities worldwide through virtual reality technology. Her story embodies the transformation of Jewish life from a history of persecution and displacement into one of global connection and unprecedented prosperity. Sarah's company, Virtual Beit Knesset, allows Jews anywhere in the world to participate in religious services, cultural events, and educational programs through immersive digital experiences. A Jew in rural Montana can attend high holiday services at Jerusalem's Western Wall. An elderly Holocaust survivor in Buenos Aires can visit the synagogue of her childhood in Poland, digitally reconstructed from historical records. A young family in Singapore can participate in their cousin's bar mitzvah in Detroit in real time. The technology represents more than business innovation. It embodies the completion of a historical circle that began with forced dispersion and has culminated in chosen connection. The same people who were scattered across the globe by persecution and opportunity can now instantly reunite across any distance, maintaining relationships and shared experiences that transcend geography. Today's Jewish communities represent the Jews present the experiences that transcend geography. Today's Jewish communities represent the culmination of 2 millennia of migration, adaptation, and survival against impossible odds. The diaspora that began with forced exile has become a global network of interconnected communities that maintain both local distinctiveness and shared identity. Jews today live on every continent, speak every major language, and participate in every aspect of modern civilization, while maintaining connections to their ancient heritage. The numbers alone tell an extraordinary story of success and influence, far beyond demographic representation. The global Jewish population, estimated at around 15 million people, represents less than 0.2% of humanity, yet has won over 20% of all Nobel Prizes since their inception. Jewish inventors and entrepreneurs have created companies worth trillions of dollars. Jewish scientists have made fundamental discoveries that have transformed human understanding of the universe. Jewish artists have produced works that define modern culture. But these statistics only hint at the deeper transformation that has occurred in Jewish life over the past century. From being a people defined by persecution, restriction, and powerlessness, Jews have become active participants and often leaders in virtually every field of human endeavor, while maintaining distinct communities and traditions that connect them to their ancient origins. This renaissance builds on foundations laid by previous generations who maintained Jewish identity and values despite facing unimaginable hardships. Every Jewish community today contains families whose stories include persecution, displacement, loss, and renewal, spanning multiple continents and centuries. The memory of the Holocaust, the expulsions from Spain and other countries, the pogroms of Eastern Europe, and countless other traumatic experiences remain embedded in Jewish collective consciousness. Yet from this history of suffering has emerged extraordinary resilience and creativity. Jewish communities have developed sophisticated institutions for preserving identity across generations and distances that serve as models for other ethnic and religious communities worldwide. Jewish day schools, community centers, synagogues, and cultural organizations exist in virtually every major city on earth. The relationship between Israel and diaspora communities has become central to modern Jewish identity in ways that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Israel serves not just as a Jewish state, but as a cultural and spiritual center that influences Jewish life worldwide while being influenced by diaspora communities in return. Hebrew language study, Israeli music and literature, and connections to Israeli institutions enrich diaspora communities, while diaspora support strengthens Israel economically, politically, and culturally. This relationship has created new forms of Jewish identity that incorporate both particular national loyalties and universal Jewish connections. American Jews can be patriotic Americans and committed Zionists simultaneously. French Jews can participate fully in French society while maintaining strong emotional and practical connections to Israel. Brazilian Jews can celebrate their Latin American heritage while supporting Jewish causes worldwide. Modern Jewish migration patterns reflect both traditional concerns about security and persecution, alongside new opportunities for education, career advancement, and cultural engagement. Young Jews move to cities with vibrant Jewish communities, not just for safety, but for the enrichment that comes from participating in active Jewish cultural life. Parents choose neighborhoods based partly on access to Jewish schools and institutions that can provide their children with both excellent secular education and strong Jewish identity formation. The digital revolution has created unprecedented possibilities for Jewish connection and community that transcend traditional geographic boundaries. Online learning platforms enable anyone to study Jewish texts with the world's leading scholars regardless of their physical location. Virtual synagogue services connect isolated individuals with global communities during times when travel is impossible or impractical. Social media platforms help Jewish professionals network across continents, sharing opportunities and collaborating on projects that span multiple countries. Dating apps designed specifically for Jewish singles help young people find partners within their communities, despite living in areas with small Jewish populations. Professional associations for Jewish lawyers, doctors, academics, and business leaders facilitate mentoring and collaboration across national boundaries. This connectivity has created new forms of Jewish identity that previous generations could never have imagined. Modern Jewish professionals might live in New York while maintaining business relationships in London, sending their children to Jewish summer camps in Israel, and regularly visiting aging parents in Toronto. Their Jewish identity incorporates elements from multiple cultures and countries rather than being rooted in any single geographic location. But technology has also created new challenges for Jewish community life. The same digital platforms that enable global Jewish connection can also reduce motivation for local community involvement. Young Jews who can access Jewish content online may feel less need to attend local synagogue services or participate in community organizations. The abundance of choices available through digital platforms can actually weaken local institutions that depend on member participation and support. Anti-Semitism, unfortunately, remains a persistent challenge despite Jewish success and integration. Worldwide, social media platforms have amplified ancient hatreds, while creating new forms for spreading conspiracy theories and organizing harassment campaigns. The internet enables anti-Semites to coordinate attacks across national boundaries while also providing tools for Jewish communities to respond rapidly and effectively. The forms of contemporary anti-Semitism often differ from historical patterns in ways that can make them more difficult to identify and combat. Rather than explicit religious or racial hatred, modern anti-Semitism frequently disguises itself as anti-Zionism. Conspiracy theories about Jewish influence in media or finance, or claims about Jewish disloyalty to their countries of residence, university campuses, once bastions of Jewish intellectual achievement and upward mobility, have sometimes become sites of anti-Jewish hostility disguised as political activism. Jewish students report feeling unwelcome or unsafe because of their Jewish identity or support for Israel. Faculty members face pressure to distance themselves from Jewish causes or Israeli institutions. Yet, Jewish communities have developed sophisticated responses to these challenges through education, advocacy, and coalition building. Holocaust museums and education programs work to ensure that historical lessons are preserved and transmitted to new generations who have no direct connection to Holocaust survivors. Anti-defamation organizations monitor incidents of anti-Semitism and hate crimes while advocating for Jewish rights and interests in political and legal forums. Security measures protect Jewish institutions, while community leaders work to build bridges with other religious and ethnic groups, creating coalitions against hatred and discrimination that benefit all minority communities. Jewish organizations have often been leaders in advocating for civil rights, religious freedom, and social justice causes that extend far beyond specifically Jewish interests. That the diversity within modern Jewish communities reflects the global nature of Jewish migration and settlement patterns over the past century. Ashkenazi Jews from European backgrounds, Sephardic Jews tracing ancestry to Spain and Portugal, Mizrahi Jews from Middle Eastern and North African communities, Ethiopian Jews, Indian Jews, and many other distinct traditions contribute to the richness of contemporary Jewish life. Each community maintains its distinctive customs, languages, culinary traditions, and religious practices while participating in broader Jewish civilization. Moroccan Jews in France preserve their ancestors' music and cuisine while attending French schools and working in French businesses. Persian Jews in Los Angeles maintain their community's distinctive traditions while fully participating in American society. Syrian Jews in Brooklyn have created insular communities that maintain Middle Eastern customs while achieving remarkable economic success in American markets. This diversity has enriched Jewish life immensely while also creating challenges for community leaders trying to serve populations with very different needs, expectations, and cultural backgrounds. Synagogues must accommodate worship styles that developed in different countries. Schools must teach children whose families originated in dozens of different countries. Community centers must offer programming that appeals to Jews with vastly different cultural references and experiences. Contemporary Jewish women have achieved unprecedented levels of education, professional success, and religious leadership that would have been unthinkable to previous generations. Orthodox communities that traditionally limited women's public roles have created new opportunities within traditional frameworks, allowing women to become religious authorities, teachers, and community leaders while maintaining traditional family structures. Conservative and Reform communities have ordained women as rabbis and cantors for decades, fundamentally transforming the nature of Jewish religious leadership. Secular Jewish women lead major institutions, businesses, and movements worldwide, while often maintaining strong connections to Jewish identity and community involvement. Young Jews today face choices and opportunities their ancestors could never have imagined. They can live anywhere in the world, pursue any career, marry within or outside their communities, observe Jewish law strictly or selectively, connect with Jewish institutions intensively, or maintain minimal formal involvement while still identifying as Jewish. This freedom represents the fulfillment of dreams that sustained Jewish communities through centuries of persecution and limitation. Yet it also creates anxieties about continuity and identity that Jewish communities must address thoughtfully and creatively. How do you maintain community bonds when membership becomes voluntary rather than necessary for survival? How do you Preserve traditions when alternative sources of meaning and belonging are readily available? The answers to these questions are still being developed by Jewish communities worldwide, but several patterns have emerged that seem promising for Jewish continuity and vitality. Communities that combine strong traditional foundations with creative adaptation to contemporary circumstances tend to be most successful in attracting and retaining young members. Chabad Lubavitch has become one of the most successful Jewish movements worldwide by combining strict Orthodox religious observance with innovative outreach methods and modern technology. Chabad centers now exist in remote locations worldwide, providing Jewish services and education to travelers, isolated families, and seekers who might otherwise have no access to Jewish community life. Reform Judaism has attracted many Jews by adapting traditional practices to contemporary sensibilities while maintaining core Jewish values and commitments. Reform communities often emphasize social justice, environmental responsibility, and interfaith cooperation while providing meaningful Jewish experiences for members with diverse backgrounds and beliefs. Jewish cultural organizations have created secular alternatives to religious community involvement that appeal to Jews who maintain ethnic identity without traditional religious commitments. Jewish museums, theaters, literary organizations, and cultural festivals provide opportunities for Jewish engagement that don't require religious belief or observance. The future of global Jewish communities will depend partly on their ability to balance tradition with innovation, community solidarity with individual freedom, local engagement with global connection. The challenges are real and significant, but so are the opportunities and resources available to meet them. We began this journey in the burning streets of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, watching as the first Jewish exiles were marched toward Babylon. We ended in the digital age, where a young entrepreneur in London can instantly connect with Jewish communities in Buenos Aires, Mumbai, and Tel Aviv, maintaining ties that would have seemed magical to her ancestors. The story we've traced spans 2,600 years and every continent on Earth. It's a story of unimaginable loss and remarkable renewal, of communities destroyed and rebuilt, of traditions that survived by changing while never losing their essential character. What have we learned from this extraordinary journey? First, that migration, even forced migration, can become a source of strength rather than just trauma. The Jewish diaspora, born from persecution and exile, became a global network that enabled survival, prosperity, and influence far beyond what any single homeland could have provided. The very dispersion that was meant to weaken Jewish civilization became the foundation for its resilience. Second, that identity can transcend geography when it's rooted in shared memory, law, and practice rather than just place. Jews created the first truly portable civilization, one that could be recreated anywhere people gathered to study ancient texts, observe traditional practices, and transmit cultural memory to the next generation. Third, that adaptation and preservation can work together rather than against each other. Jewish communities succeeded not by remaining static, but by constantly evolving while maintaining core principles. They learned local languages while preserving Hebrew, adopted local customs while maintaining distinct practices, participated fully in broader societies while maintaining communal identity. Fourth, that even the darkest chapters in human history can't destroy the human capacity for renewal. The Holocaust represented the most systematic attempt at genocide in human history. Yet within a generation, Jewish communities had not only rebuilt, but had created the State of Israel, strengthened diaspora institutions, and achieved unprecedented levels of influence and prosperity. What does this history mean for our world today? In an era of global migration, climate displacement, and refugee crises, the Jewish experience offers both hope and practical wisdom. It demonstrates that displaced peoples can maintain their identity while contributing to their new societies. That diversity strengthens rather than weakens civilizations, and that successful integration requires mutual respect and opportunity rather than forced assimilation. The Jewish story also reminds us that progress isn't linear. Periods of acceptance and prosperity can be followed by persecution and displacement. The freedoms and opportunities that Jews enjoy today weren't inevitable. They resulted from centuries of struggle, advocacy, and the gradual expansion of human rights and democratic values. For Jewish communities themselves, this history provides both inspiration and warning. The same forces that enabled Jewish survival, education, community solidarity, cultural creativity, and adaptability remain essential in the modern world. But new challenges require new responses. Assimilation pressures, declining religious observance, intermarriage, and the complexity of modern life all threaten community continuity in ways different from traditional persecution. The establishment of Israel, after nearly 2 millennia of exile, represents a remarkable return to history's stage as a sovereign people. Yet it also creates new responsibilities and challenges. How does a people that survived by being everywhere adapt to being somewhere again? How does a state balance its role as a homeland for all Jews with its responsibilities to all its citizens? Perhaps, most importantly, the Jewish experience demonstrates that human beings are capable of extraordinary resilience when they maintain hope, support each other, and remain committed to values that transcend immediate circumstances. The same communities that produce merchants in medieval Spain, scholars in Babylonian academies, and immigrants building new lives in American cities continue today as Nobel Prize winners, tech entrepreneurs, artists, and advocates for justice. Worldwide, the migrations that scattered Jews across the globe weren't just Jewish stories. They were human stories that shaped the societies they touched. Jewish immigrants contributed to the prosperity of every country that welcomed them. Jewish ideas influenced philosophy, science, literature, and social justice movements worldwide. The Jewish experience became part of the broader human story of migration, adaptation, and survival. As we face an uncertain future marked by climate change, political instability, and technological disruption, the lessons of Jewish history remain relevant. Communities that maintain their values while adapting to changing circumstances, that invest in education and mutual support, that build bridges rather than walls, are more likely to thrive regardless of external challenges. The Jewish journey, from ancient exile to global renaissance, proves that no catastrophe is final, no displacement is permanent, and no people is too small to make a lasting impact on human civilization. It shows us that survival isn't just about enduring. It's about transforming challenges into opportunities, maintaining hope in the face of despair, and building communities that can flourish anywhere. Today, as millions of people around the world face displacement, persecution, and uncertainty, the Jewish story offers a message of hope. It reminds us that human beings are capable of rebuilding their lives, preserving their identities, and contributing to their societies even after losing everything. It demonstrates that diversity makes communities stronger, that refugees can become assets rather than burdens, and that the human capacity for renewal is infinite. The scattered people who began this journey as exiles in Babylon have become a global community that continues to enrich human civilization while maintaining its distinctive character. Their story is far from over. As new challenges emerge and new opportunities arise, Jewish communities will continue to adapt, migrate, and contribute to the ongoing human story. From the rivers of Babylon to the digital highways of the 21st century, the Jewish people have shown that home isn't just a place. It's a set of relationships, values, and commitments that can be carried anywhere and rebuilt everywhere. Their journey continues, and their story remains one of humanity's greatest testimonies to the power of resilience adaptation, and hope. The migration that began with destruction has become a story of creation. The diaspora that started with loss has become a source of global connection. The people who were scattered to disappear have instead helped shape every corner of the world they touched. This is the enduring legacy of the Jewish journey across time and space, proof that even in our darkest moments, the human spirit can not only survive, but ultimately triumph.